Good morning. Really lovely to be with you this morning. My name is Dan Pratt. I'm a minister based in Southend, and I'm sorry I can't be with you at Shopgate Baptist Church this morning. As you're aware, there's a current pandemic going on, and of course this impacts our ability to be able to meet together. But whether you are together in person or whether you are joining us remotely, it's really lovely to be with you this morning again. It's been a few months, if not a year or so, since I was with you the last time, so I hope you're all doing really well. Today we're going to be focusing on the story of Jesus calming the storm. And I wonder whether you have ever had an experience of your life feeling like it was spinning out of control. Where it's felt like there are waves crashing around you, and you're hanging on for dear life, wondering if you're going to survive. And for many of us during the last number of months with the pandemic, it has at times felt like that for me. It's been quite a stressful time as we've all adapted to having to live through a global pandemic. And I certainly know the feeling of almost feeling like the boat is rocking and shaking, and at any time it could capsize. I'm going to read from Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, and this is from verse 35. It says, "That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' And Jesus got up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' And then the wind died down and he was completely calm. He said to his disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' And they were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.'" Now, what I find interesting about this is both the disciples as well as Jesus's reaction to this story. And I'm going to share a picture with you now. And it highlights the storm and Jesus in the midst of it. And in this picture, we've got the disciples clinging on for dear life. And of course, they were experienced at sea, and they were fishermen, and this would not have been their first storm. And yet somehow this storm was indicating that it was life-threatening. They were fearful for their lives. And so they were clinging on to the ropes, to the sides, and I can just imagine them being completely storm-swept. And yet Jesus, in response to the storm, is just sleeping calmly. And I don't quite know how he managed to do that. But there was this sense of, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" This sense of being terrified, but also a sense of, "Jesus, why aren't you doing anything in the midst of this?" And perhaps, like me, you've been asking questions during this time. Where is God in the midst of this? In the midst of suffering, and in the midst of a pandemic, and of course people being ill and even dying. Where is God in the midst of this? And we may have even been asking God that question, "Don't you care if we drown?" And actually, when we read the Psalms, I think that's a really normal and natural response, where often David is crying out to God in terror or anguish, or saying, "Why are you silent? Why do you hide your face from us?" Part of my ministry is in helping churches respond to modern slavery, but I also minister as a reserve army chaplain. And so there's myself in the middle. This was on my first day of wearing the army, or the Padres, as we're known as Padres, the kit that we have. So this was my induction course. I've been with the reserves for 1.5 years now, almost 2 years, and I am attached to a field hospital in London, and I provide pastoral and support for the unit. And many of them are medics, many of them are reservists working for the NHS. And during the time of COVID, we were able to meet through Zoom and through other video conferencing facilities, not in person. And I had the privilege of leading them in a session exploring pastoral care in times of crisis. And I wonder for you what pastoral care or self-care looks like. Sometimes when we think of self-care, we think of restorative activities. And so sometimes people say, oh, you know, if they're wanting to look after themselves, oh, I'll just go for a spa day or a pamper day, or maybe even just getting a takeaway and watching some TV or Netflix, or even having, you know, a nice bottle of wine. Those are all things that we do as a little bit of luxury. But actually, how do we take care of ourselves more deeply than just these quick fixes? And I want us to have a quick look at that, because part of the work that I do with the army is thinking through how do we encourage people to look after themselves pastorally as well as spiritually as well. So how can we provide both pastoral and spiritual care? And so one of the key ways, first of all, is understanding stress. And a good definition for stress is that it's a physical, mental, or emotional response to events that can cause mental, emotional, and physical tension. And of course, I am sure that all of us have experienced different degrees of stress during the last number of months. And often the stress, it can cause us to respond both mentally, emotionally, and physically. Of course, God has created us as whole beings, and so therefore it's no wonder that if we experience stress, sometimes this can have outworkings both within our emotions, but also in other ways as well, including physical tension. And if we think of ourselves as a holistic being, stress has implications in different ways. And firstly, cognitively, sometimes stress can cause memory problems. There's an inability to concentrate. And I know for myself, during the initial stages of COVID, I found it really difficult to concentrate. My attention span was super short, and I had racing thoughts as well. And with stress, that's often a natural way of exhibiting the stress. And of course, emotionally, we may not be enjoying life. We may be feeling down or feeling overwhelmed, or even have a short temper, or having an inability to relax. And of course, those that we live with will probably be noticing the most, as well as us noticing how stress is impacting them in those ways. And stress, of course, impacts us, maybe not in all of those ways, but it might be some of those ways. And then physically, stress can cause excessive perspiration. There can be chest pains or frequent illnesses, sometimes nausea or headaches, or even skin conditions like eczema and other things can flare up if we're experiencing stress. And then behavioural implications for stress. We may have an increase or decrease of appetite. I know I was really enjoying pizza and ice cream during the time of the initial stages of COVID, and also nervous habits. I experienced difficulty sleeping, and I'm still waking up a lot earlier than I used to before the pandemic. And then also other excessive use of alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs. Sometimes stress can trigger certain responses to more addictive habits. So of course, all those things stress can impact us in all those ways. And one of the things that we were trying to explore with our army unit was to think through actually how do we ourselves reduce stress. So what is my role in stress creation as well as reduction? And firstly, I would like to suggest being mindful of ourselves. And mindfulness has become quite a go-to term in terms of being aware of our present and our here and now. So for example, when we go for a walk, are we mindful of what we are doing, or are our thoughts just racing and taking over us? Are we feeling the wind on our skin? Are we hearing the birds? Are we hearing the trees rustle with the wind? Mindfulness is about being present with our here and now. So the question is, are we mindful of ourselves? Do we know how stress is impacting us? From the previous slides, what ways is stress impacting us now? And how do we respond to the stress, both positively and negatively? And of course, I've mentioned some of the more negative aspects in terms of, maybe excessive eating or drinking, or habits like drinking too much coffee or smoking or too much alcohol. How do we respond in terms of stress, both positively as well as negatively? And I would like to suggest that we could develop a very personal action plan in responding to stress. So it would be about taking a deliberate and planned approach to stress in order so that we would reduce or tolerate or even minimize stress, and also to develop healthy rhythms of life in the midst of that. So I wonder for you what your action plan would be. So for example, some people recommend taking 5 minutes of stillness every day. And it's an opportunity just to sit down and relax, whether that's inside or outside. And it's just to be comfortable, and also just to still our thoughts, to still our breathing, just to, take regular breathing, and rather than racing around, it's an opportunity just to pause and to be still and to be present in that moment. And we may not be, wanting to have our minds racing during that time, but it's just trying to calm ourselves and to be present. So what is it that you're feeling at that time? Are you feeling the wind on your skin? What are you hearing? What are you sensing? Just taking 5 minutes every day. I also really enjoy some sense of movement. So our bodies are meant to be moved. And of course, we know that scientifically that walking or running or certain forms of exercise increases endorphins, which help us to sleep and produces a more positive feeling. So often doing some sense of movement or exercise each day is helpful. Environmental psychologists are also indicating that time with nature is incredibly important in reducing stress. Apparently 93% of our lives are indoors, and there's a sense of, particularly with some of the good weather that we're having, it's an opportunity to get outside and to just have some restorative time outside. And so it's not really about getting it right or wrong, it's really thinking through what works for us. How do we develop healthy rhythms of life in reducing stress? And it brings us back to the Bible passage that we read. And Jesus is in the midst of the storm with them, and yet he is not active initially. And the disciples, of course, are scared for their lives. They're terrified. And maybe we might have been feeling that as well. And I think there's a sense of actually, there's not a problem with that we are who we are, and we experience fear, we experience times of doubt and terror sometimes, and it can feel like we're clinging on for dear life. And there can also be a sense of, where is God? And asking, actually, I can't feel or sense God in the midst of this storm. And one of the passages that I find quite reassuring is from John's Gospel, chapter 20. And it's when Jesus reappears to the disciples after he's been resurrected. And so Thomas, doubting Thomas, was still with them, and the doors were locked. And the text says, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas says to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus responds, "Because you have seen me, you have believed, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And so there's this sense that Thomas is still doubting, even though there have been sightings of Jesus before. And even when Jesus reappears, he's still doubting, and he has to physically touch the resurrected Christ. And yet Jesus is saying, actually, because you've seen me, you've believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. And so in the midst of this pandemic, there's a sense of, yes, I think it's normal to doubt. It's normal to question, where is God in the midst of the stress and the anguish and the sorrow? And there's also a sense of, I think, Jesus and God being gracious to us, and a sense of they know that we can't physically see, in many ways, God being active in the midst of this time. And yet our faith, no matter how small, is still present. It's even the size of a mustard seed. That's all we need. That's what Jesus was saying. So in the midst of this storm, we just need the smallest amount of faith to appreciate that God is with us, even if we can't see him being active. And the psalmist says, "Awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression?" So we're certainly not the first people in history to have experienced this anguish and this sense of perhaps God being silent. If for you God is very real and present in the midst of this, that's wonderful, and hang on to that. But actually, if God is silent and quiet in the midst of this, then hold on to him.